President Trump is all about peace, especially in the Russia-Ukraine war, wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and is putting a lot of political capital on the floor to try and achieve it. Or is he? He's sort of trying to end the war. He's also kind of sort of trying to make Europeans happy. He's sort of trying to make Zelensky happy. Definitely trying to sell some weapons, which is one of the more popular things in Washington, D.C., no matter who's in the White House. And President Trump seems to be trying to do a little bit of all of that. Not sure he's doing very successful at any of it in particular. To try and kind of untie this big mess, we have Patrick Henningsen back with us today. Always a pleasure to have you on, host of the Sunday Wire, patrickhenningsen.substack.com, and just really experienced journalist. So we're really grateful to have you back on today.
Great to be with you, Daniel.
Well, look, let's see if you can clarify for everybody what seems to be pretty muddled, because we have, President Trump, obviously, he has taken a lot of effort, and no kidding. I mean, it's genuine that he's trying to end this war. I mean, Biden before him didn't even talk to anybody and had only intended to stretch the war out and support it with no strategy on where it was even going. He sold a lot of bombs and bullets to just about everybody who would take them. And then here Trump comes in, and at least he's talking to him. He says he's having phone calls. He's sending his emissaries. Then now he's met with Putin in face-to-face on U.S. soil, etc. But the question is, how much effort is he really putting on to end it?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think when I saw this meeting in Alaska, it seemed like a real good power move, for optics, for the Trump administration. Definitely, it was great for him domestically, internationally, and for Russia, it was fantastic because it shows that Russia was not isolated. And so it's U.S. talking to Russia, Europe's on the sideline, Zelensky's on the sideline, then Trump goes to Washington, and the Europeans come and line up like staff, like a staff meeting with Trump behind the desk in the Oval Office, Zelensky as well with the Europeans. So that kind of reestablishes a pecking order of who the important global actors are here. The United States and Russia first, Europe second, and then Zelensky distant third. So Ukraine really doesn't have much representation there with a president that's completely out of mandate, going on very long, and no chance of elections coming up. So I think from that point of view, great. And Trump has been acknowledged by the European players as basically having some kind of a viable path to peace, and they're all in on the Trump plan. But it's the promises being made there, some checks being written by Trump that might not be able to be cashed. One of them is that everyone's projecting onto these talks what they think is going to be the viable deal, i.e., that Russia's prepared to do land swaps in exchange for security guarantees or vice versa, and it's debatable. And Trump's very clever and this is where I'm going to get very critical, because Trump is creating concessions that aren't actually there. Like he's saying, well, they're going to, you're not going to get Crimea. You're going to have to give up Crimea. Crimea is not even on the table.
It's not on the table, yeah.
But Trump stacked it up as a virtual concession that he can somehow use in leverage the conversation. But none of this is really dealing. This is not real negotiations. But from the European point of view and from the sort of mainstream point of view, yeah, that sounds plausible what Trump is saying. So it sounds like Russia's ready to deal on certain things that they're not ready to deal on at all. And it makes it sound like, well, both sides got to give a little bit here, when in fact, Russia's really not giving anything. It's pretty much identical, their terms of demilitarization, Nazification, recognition of the new regions. They're not going to give any long-term security guarantees. Europe's saying, we want the security guarantees front-loaded. We want that up front. And then we're going to, talk about whatever. And Trump said, I'm going to get those security guarantees for you. And then Europe's all happy, clapping like seals. Oh, we support Donald Trump's effort to get those security guarantees. So it's kind of This is a bit of a theatrical performance at this point. And meanwhile, what matters is the facts on the ground. Facts on the ground is what matters, and the facts on the ground are most definitely in Russia's favor.
Okay, so that given that truth, and we are certainly in 100% agreement with you on that. Let's kind of zoom back out to about the 30,000-foot level for a second, and just kind of, I can't ascribe any motivation or intention to Trump because I can't get inside of his brain. All I can do is look at what happens and what has happened, and it just kind of makes me look around and go, something doesn't look quite right. So we've had the European side, the Ursula von der Leyen's, Macron, Starmer, et al., Merz. They've all been pretty consistent on what they want, which is basically everything to their advantage, and Russia to give up stuff that it doesn't have to because of its power. You had Zelensky, of course, who keeps on periodically saying, as he did on the Independence Day on Sunday, that he's still going to win. He's still thinking he's going to. We haven't lost. You hadn't won yet, but we definitely won't lose, is the way he put it. So he's still focused on that. You have the Russians over here who, I mean, you could probably go back further, but we'll just go back to 14 June 2024, where Putin laid out exactly the terms you just mentioned there, and they haven't changed any at all. And then you have Trump right here, and these two sides were pretty far away. If you can go Ukraine and Europe one side and Russia on the other side, and if anything, there was no reason why we would ever expect the Russian side to give in on any of these points that they wanted, because they have the power position. There's no reason to think that these guys are going to suddenly become reality because they haven't changed before and they haven't changed after. So why would Trump want to put all this political capital into Alaska and then immediately into the Oval Office with all of these folks when the prospects of getting any of them to move was really low? And in fact, that is exactly how it's played out. Russia has not shifted an inch. Neither has Zelensky. Neither has Europe, except maybe they've gone a little further away. How do you see that whole dynamic?
Well, I think for Trump, it's a domestic imperative. I mean, he's elected. He was elected on bringing this war to an end. He was the guy who's going to deliver the solution in 24 hours or whatever. But here we are 7-8 months later, and domestically, I think he's got to be seen to be doing something here, because this situation is really degrading fast. And I mean, we could say that the rush to get this summit in place is because of the collapse of the Ukrainian front line. That would be probably a big reason why the U.S. would want to somehow move, because they're looking at the quicker they get to a negotiated settlement. And that's another thing that was established at Alaska, is that there's not going to be any ceasefire. That's a prelude to a negotiated settlement. It's going to be the other way around. And that's just kind of now at least universally accepted. But the quicker they get to that negotiated settlement, that they could freeze the conflict. In other words, the borders, the front lines can be frozen, because that's a big concern, because that really defines how that ends up, is going to define whether Russia can be seen to have won or seen to have been forced into a stalemate, or whatever, however they spin it. But it can't be, from a European and a NATO point of view, or EU point of view, it cannot be seen that Russia has viewed to have won or got everything that they want. And they might be able to spin it, even if they froze it today and gave them the 4 regions and whatever, they could still spin it as that Russia wanted all of Ukraine, and so that's a win. Or they didn't get to the Dnieper River and we stopped them there. They didn't get Odessa, we've stopped them there. So there's different ways that you can spin this. But the most important thing about this isn't to do with Trump, it's to do with Russia, because now what Alaska reset the whole power dynamic, and that's that everyone's conforming to the Russian position, you see. So that's the real power
Trump
shift.
Definitely did, for sure, because he was going in with a deadline for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire or bone-crushing sanctions, and that obviously went completely away. He came out of Alaska literally repeating what the Russian side said, which you just mentioned, which was, no, negotiate first, ceasefire second, etc. So he completely went over to that verbally. But then, sorry, go ahead.
Just quickly, what's really important about that is that whether they succeed or fail, that because Russia's participating in this meeting called by Trump, that if it fails, and it probably will fail in the interim, I'm guessing it will, just based on past patterns, that Russia's not going to be blamed. They're making a calculated guess. They have to participate. And if they do, they've been consistent the whole way. So if anything goes wrong, it's not going to be because Russia's changed its position or been flippant or whatever. But Trump has been very erratic. The Europeans have been very erratic. So the international community would more likely, the suspicion or the blame might go on them or Zelensky and not Russia. So that's what's really important about the power shift, is that who would be blamed if it fails.
And going back to your previous point there about the maybe the accelerated timeline because of what they saw happening on the battlefield, that's completely logical and reasonable to want to do that. But then if you're going to do it, and if you're Trump, you're not going to move Russia. You don't have any leverage to compel them to do so. You do have leverage to compel Europe to do something, and Zelensky will do whatever is told, whether he wants to or not, because we have all the leverage on him. But Trump hasn't used any of the leverage that I've seen so far, and in fact, he's allowed them to continue to make the statements that they make, and they're still unmoved. So we're no closer than we were before Anchorage.
No, and if you look at the attack on the pipeline that supplies crude oil, Russian oil via Ukraine, transit through Ukraine to both Hungary and Slovakia, the Druzhba pipeline, the timing of that was clearly staged to undermine or to damage the meeting in Alaska. There's no doubt about that, and the Europeans coming to Washington. So we have a situation still where we have the SBU, who is basically joined at the hip with the CIA and British MI6 and whoever else, and that they're doing things that actively undermine the negotiation or the peace process. So, and as I said, on a couple of other programs of the last couple of weeks, even if Putin and Trump draw a contract up in blood, okay, put their fingers on the paper, there's nothing that's going to guarantee that the Europeans or Zelensky and the regime in Kiev are going to abide by it, cooperate with it, or anything. So it's really just between the U.S. and Russia. That's the real problem, actually.
Yeah, and I think we can see a lot of that playing out. And in fact, we saw both the Russian side and the U.S. side both acknowledge that they are looking beyond the war and they are looking to improve relations, et cetera, which we'll actually touch on in a little bit here. But let's turn back to Trump, because here, I think this is a couple of days ago, he was making this comment from the Oval Office in terms of, he was being asked about, where things are. Is Russia going to accept any of the demands that he's making, et cetera? And he kind of went back to, well, here's a good news story. The way he's telling it, we're no longer giving any money to Ukraine.
They request through NATO. We deal with NATO. We don't deal really with Ukraine. NATO requests missiles. They want Patriots. They want missiles. We give the missiles to NATO. NATO pays us in full and does what they want. I mean, I think they give them mostly they can do other things with them too, because we're dealing with NATO. We pay no money to Ukraine. We gave $350 billion to Ukraine.
I never know where this $350 billion figure comes from. I've never seen the math add up to that, but that's I guess neither here nor there. But he seems pretty excited about selling U.S. weapons to NATO for the purpose to then funnel on to Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Well, that allows him to kind of wash his hand of that was a big complaint by the MAGA base, and it was used to kind of rev up this issue early on after inauguration, which is that, why are we wasting all this money on Ukraine? We've got other things to spend the money on. It's not a priority. Zelensky's corrupt, all this stuff. So Trump kind of solves that problem right there and turns it into a little W in terms of, a transactional W for the president there. So, but it's relatively small. It's also problematic as well, because the way that Trump is framing is, we don't have anything to do with what happens with these weapons. The Europeans can do what they want. We're going to sell them the weapons. Well, what happens if some of these weapons are used to hit targets inside Russia, hitting civilians, and Russia decides they're going to escalate there? If it was a direct U.S. responsibility, then at least there's a chain of accountability there that could be parlayed into some emergency diplomatic communications to de-escalate, perhaps, or something like that. But now with this, he's almost delegating it to the Europeans. And if you listen to the Europeans talk, Friedrich Merz, Keir Starmer, they're basically talking up World War III. In the case of Britain, Keir Starmer said we need to destroy Russia's shadow fleet. He's talking about taking out all Russian tankers in the Baltic Sea and making it hostile for shipping in the Baltic. And I mean, that's World War III talk, basically. So it was always my worry, and I'm not alone, of course, that when the U.S. takes this politically expedient position to say, oh, we're stepping back, and the Europeans have to take up the burden of their own collective security, and we want a backseat. America first. We're going to do. No, there's risks associated with that, and I don't have to tell people what history says over the last 100 years about Europe dragging the United States back into major wars. I mean, that's the paradox of this situation. Is yes, the United States is carrying this burden, but do you trust the crazy infighting, tribal, petty rivalries of the elite Europeans? I don't actually.
Yeah,
and I've a lot of history to back that up.
Not very high on my list of things I'd like to see as well. Fortunately, not all the Europeans are on board with that. And in fact, you mentioned a second ago, Slovakia and Hungary in the Druzhba issue. I'll also hit that in a minute. But one of the things that Viktor Orban said is that even Trump's comments there, not quite the way it appears. When he says we're going to sell it to NATO, and then NATO's going to do whatever they want, Viktor Orban points out that NATO is just a name. It's actually 32 independent countries, and well, there's a bit of a problem.
So who made the deal with President Trump? Somebody who has no legitimacy to do so. So it will be never fulfilled, or I don't know who will fulfill that agreement. Then there is a secret chapter of this agreement, if I understand correctly, that's something about Ukraine. And I think this is the most important and most dangerous point. As we are informed, there is a deal that the United States will sell weapons to the Ukrainians in a way that it will be paid by the European Union. But who will pay for that? Because Brussels cannot do so. So again, tariff is one thing, but then there are three other points when the President of the United States made a deal with somebody who has no chance to fulfill that obligation. So I think it will create a lot of difficulties and discourses in the future. Because President Trump will say, why this agreement is not fulfilled? We said, it's not our deal. You made a deal with the President of the Commission. Go there.
So yeah, he's saying I didn't make any deal to buy weapons from Washington D.C. and sell to Ukraine. Robert Fico made nearly the identical argument. I think the day before, he said the same thing, and actually expressly, he said we are not going to buy weapons and then hand them over to Ukraine. We're not going to do that. So if those two were saying that, I don't know how many other countries are going to be excited about spending their money to forward something onto Ukraine. I guess some will. What do you think of that?
Well, then they're going to have to, vote among the NATO members of who wants this war more badly than the other members, and that they should pay. But of course, that's not how it works. So Orban's flagged up a basic thing when Trump speaks of NATO, he's speaking of it like it's an organization with an arms budget. They do have budgets at Brussels, but it's the collective members' military spend that comprises the military force of NATO. So that's a legitimate question. When it's the United States picking up the tab, it's a straight transaction. It's a deal. The United States is supplying the weapons, whether it's lend-lease or they're just giving direct shipments, or in the case Trump was also floating about the piling on more debt onto Ukraine to pay for all this. I mean, there's a certain amount of debt that's probably going to be written off, but there is a significant amount of the aid and even some military aid that technically would have to, go in the liability column for Ukraine. So, but Orban, very canny politician, and he's not going to let that one go. And he's also he and the rest of the Central Asian countries, that's a real opposition bloc within the EU and NATO. they're right on the front line, all those countries. And I think Romania would have been like that if there wasn't meddling in their election by USAID and the US. So I mean, that's pretty much the whole of the bordering countries of Ukraine. So what does that tell you? That tells you that everybody who's furthest away from the conflict in Europe is the most vocal and hawkish. So that's not going to work. So that's very interesting how this is going to play out. There's problems with NATO and these types of situations. Again, when America comes out, you have real problems that could actually affect the integrity of NATO as an organization.
Well, now let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. Let's say that, and now I think it's probably a safe assumption that there will be some members of NATO that are going to be willing to pony up some cash and to buy these weapons. But then that exposes another problem, and that is how many weapons do we have to sell? Because when you look at our stockpiles, whether you're talking interceptor missiles, artillery shells, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and more artillery pieces, etc., we're down way past the fat. We're into like the bones in some cases here, and our industrial capacity is nowhere near what the Russian side is. And I'm talking about the West at large. I remember, and I want to say it was December of last year, so before the Biden administration left office, and there was we played on this show, and I don't remember if you were on that one or not, but we had Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, was talking about how, listen, the Ukraine side keeps asking for air interceptor missiles, and he said we just don't have them. In fact, the NATO had allegedly 5% of its own needs on the eastern flank in terms of that. We had Marco Rubio in Senate testimony in April said the same thing, that they keep asking us for interceptor missiles and we don't have it, and we're not going to give any up. So that was in April, and in December of last year. That the production capacity has not increased since then. It's increased since 22, but it hasn't increased since then. Allegedly somewhere around 660 missiles per year. Still significant limitations on the artillery shells beyond what we wanted to do. Can we, if everything is the spigots are open, can the West support Ukraine in basically an endless war?
Well, effectively, the U.S. is, fighting a two-front proxy war with Ukraine and Israel, and who's going to be at the top of the pecking order in terms of first dibs on Patriot missiles and interceptors and all these other essential items? It's going to be Israel. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of what you see in the way these negotiations are going and the arrangements is to give a little bit of breathing room for Israel and for the United States support for Israel. And they're hoping the Europeans are going to be able to kind of patch up and sort of make it work. But it's kind of dangerous, too, because if you remember when the United States was running out of when the Biden's last year, they're running out of certain types of bombs and other things that they had to basically supply cluster bombs, cluster munitions to Ukraine because there was nothing left in stock. So then you have a situation where that was viewed as an escalation by the Russian Federation. That was a red line. Then Russia reciprocates with something else that's seen to be escalatory. And then you could have the same situation here with, let's say, Patriot missile batteries or other interceptor missiles or other munitions where, Germany will, opt to send in its Taurus missiles or something like this in lieu of a lack of supplies from the United States, because there's going to be a backlog. What else does it tell us, Daniel? It tells us that there is going to be a backlog. That means that the supplies are going to be delayed. That means we're talking about a window here of 3 years or something like that, 2 or 3 years. That means that there's people planning to keep this war going for more than a couple years from now. I mean, that's just being realistic with this talk of arms supplies.
Right. But the question is, can the Ukrainian armed forces maintain the ability to wage war with less an insufficient number of ammunition?
Definitely not. But then the Europeans' answer to that is, well, in lieu of a NATO presence on the ground, we are going to form the coalition of the willing. We're going to put European troops and support in Ukraine outside of NATO, of course, and that's how we're going to be delivering security guarantees for the Ukrainians. I mean, is that realistic? Is that going to happen? Probably not. It's hugely problematic. It's definitely going to be a deal breaker for the Russians, and it's probably not going to do Trump any favors as he's trying to midwife this peace process. But the confusion and all the different directions this is going to, and then Zelensky comes out with all these sort of platitudes and Churchillian, his weekly Churchillian address. And then he's demanding more, and he's saying, no, we're not going to compromise on this, that, and that. And so it's like the chances that there's going to be any kind of a workable pathway to peace coming from the U.S. or sorry, the Western and Ukrainian side, it's looking like really difficult right now. There's too many moving parts,
Right.
too many chefs in the kitchen.
And too many holes in the recipes to follow that one down a little bit more. I want to take a look at what the other side of this is saying, and because you can't take any of this in isolation. It all matters what all the parties say. So let's take a look at the Russian side, because especially coming out of Alaska, there was some optimism on the Russian side, as Sergei Lavrov mentioned here.
We respect President Trump because President Trump defends American national interests. And I have reason to believe that President Trump respects President Putin because he defends Russian national interests. We want peace in Ukraine. President Trump wants peace in Ukraine. The reaction to Anchorage meeting, the gathering in Washington of these European representatives, and what they were doing after Washington indicates that they don't want peace.
Yeah, so he seems pretty clear. He said, look, we respect the U.S. because they're working on their national interests. We think they respect us because we are working towards our national interests. But it seems like the Europeans are doing everything they can to try to sabotage things. What do you think?
Well, the main thing about this, and of course, Russian foreign ministry and their diplomatic team are extremely experienced. They're playing a long-term chess match here, and so what's been established now is if it does come to any kind of negotiations, or that if there's any point where Russia or NATO needs to speak to Russia, everything has to go through Trump. It has to go through Washington because Europe doesn't have direct access to Moscow. Europe still doesn't want to talk to Moscow. And Lavrov, very, very canny, very smart. He's basically saying, we are partnering with Washington. We're partnering with Russia. So that helps Trump in the sense that it raises his profile. It raises the U.S. profile, is that's the access point if they need to negotiate and talk to Moscow. And for Moscow, it's basically a safe. I mean, they've really given the Alaska thing has really, really firmed up Russia's position in this, in terms of the hierarchy of negotiations, the leverage. It's been brilliant for Moscow, and they're just playing it cool, and which is what they should be doing and getting down the business. Because see, what the Russians have, their facts, their assumptions about this conflict, the day-to-day realities of the conflict. They know they're pretty confident that they understand those details. Meanwhile, the Europeans and the Americans are still working off of propaganda talking points and a whole stack of false assumptions. And so I think in Russia's case, they're just like, let's just play the game. And if part of that game is, bigging up Donald Trump and trying to make it look like they're putting a serious effort into making these negotiations work with the U.S., and Europe hopefully will conform to some of that act, then it's a brilliant result for Moscow. They can't lose and meanwhile, they're just getting on with business on the ground. I mean, so from their point of view, if it does fail, A, they're not going to get blamed, and B, they're probably going to increase their leverage and position on the battlefield. So that means they're going to have a stronger hand to play eventually if there ever is a negotiated settlement.
Of course, they'll get blamed. They get blamed for everything. In fact, I think they get blamed if the sun goes down at the end of the day, but they seem to be used to that. As a matter of fact, we had Russian Deputy UN Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky on the show a couple of days ago, and we asked him what he thought about this situation, and he had kind of a little bit more to add on the whole Alaska European thing.
What is happening right now is that a group of countries, including Ukraine and its backers, European countries, they are trying step by step to review the things that were agreed in Alaska, slice by slice. So they started very timidly, then they started to kind of say it openly. Now they start to scream about it, testing President Trump's resolve to fulfill what was agreed in Alaska, at least what kind of understanding was there. We see that what is now being discussed and promoted in European media, in Ukrainian media, in the statements of Zelensky, his henchmen and his sponsors, is totally different from the spirit of Alaska.
So that's again, the Russian and the American position, which is kind of like what you saw Sergei Lavrov said there. And by the way, this is the video. If anybody wants to watch the whole thing, we certainly recommend that they do so. That's what the title of it was. You can go on our webpage and get that. But he went on there to say that he goes, I mean, we're not really all sad by that, because I think they kind of expect it. And then when I pointedly asked him point blank, and you can see this on the video toward the end, I said, if you don't get what you want with the diplomatic side, will you continue to fight? Or, what is the Russian position? And he just categorically said, he goes, we've been saying nothing besides that. I actually showed a clip of his boss, Nebenzia, Ambassador Nebenzia, saying the same thing earlier this year. And he said, we've never changed. We will get it on the negotiating table, or we will get it on the battlefield. We're going to continue to go down that path. That message doesn't seem to be getting through to Europe, or they just don't believe it. Which do you think it is?
They don't believe it. They can't publicly say what the real situation is. They're still talking about Donetsk and Lugansk like it's, going to be, we're going to give those territorial concessions to Russia in exchange for security guarantees. And they've lost Luhansk, and they're in the process of losing all of Donetsk very soon, probably. So that's not going to happen. It goes up in the fantasy cloud with Crimea. For things that you can negotiate to get some kind of a settlement. And meanwhile, so the Europeans and the ex-Biden people and the think tank cluster of think tanks in Washington, led by people like Michael McFaul and all these other people who basically got us into this mess to begin with in Ukraine, they're all sketching out all these different complicated negotiation frameworks. Like, we need two negotiations. We need a separate negotiation, the separate teams to do the security guarantees, and then after that we can roll it into the land swaps, and it has to be in that order. So that's not going to happen. So they're going to be arguing about this between Europe, between the Beltway, the neolib and neocon Beltway, and Ukraine, and London. There's no way that they're going to ever settle on anything that's going to get to the ultimate destination, where Trump maybe wants to go, but Trump maybe is not going to be able to go there. And I think he wants to see a settlement, but does Donald Trump, does his team really understand what that means, what that settlement means in the end, what it's going to actually look like? Because we haven't got to that stage yet. This is just right now talk. I mean, there's no sort of agreed upon framework. Russia's keeping their cards quite close to their chest. I think Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson of the Kremlin, said there's going to be no talk about the details of any negotiations, because that's going to complicate things. What do you think it's going to be on the U.S. side? Trump's going to be like tweeting out all the details. Like Wickoff created all sorts of problems after the last meeting because he was floating all this stuff out that was discussed, maybe not confirmed and not fully baked. And all it does is complicate things. So because they're just desperate to get their headlines, and to try to, what Trump likes to flood the zone with, different information and conflicting information to keep everybody on their back heels, or he just does that just because he's on a fluid consciousness stream of information all the time between the Truth Social and everything else. But but there's no discipline in the core, in the Trump core. And in Europe, it's not much better, because Europe is just having to react to Kiev, react to what everyone else is doing, and they don't have any serious discussions about anything that's practical.
Yeah, and I want to go down that path there, because there is disunity and problems within Europe itself and between some members of Europe and Ukraine itself. I saw one of our commentators here, one of our viewers who mentioned it a second ago, but so I want to get into that, and that is that there is an issue between Hungary and Slovakia with this Druzhba pipeline. You mentioned that at the top here. Thanks, Gary. This is from, I think it's yesterday's news. It says Ukrainian attacks on the Druzhba oil pipeline, for those who may not have seen it, have blocked oil imports to Hungary and Slovakia for days and provoked an ongoing war of words between Kiev, Budapest, and Bratislava. Ukraine attacked oil facilities on the Russian territory with drones and rockets. The pipeline delivers Russian oil through Ukraine and Belarus to Central Europe, where Hungary and Slovakia still import large amounts. On Sunday, Ukraine's president said, quote, we always supported the friendship between Ukraine and Hungary, and now the existence of the friendship depends on what Hungary's position is. And so you have Zelensky literally and openly threatening Orban and Fico of saying, hey, you either play ball with the way I want you to, or we can fire some more bombs and missiles here. What do you make of that? That's pretty amazing to me.
That's really bad news. I mean, just understand that Ukraine is probably getting transit fees for that oil from Russia, by the way, and Russia's always paid.
That is a crazy thing to think, that the two sides for years have been fighting, and yet Russian oil is going through Ukraine, and Ukraine is getting cash from Moscow. Just a crazy thing. But please continue.
100%. I'm pretty sure that that's the case.
I am sure it is definitely the case.
And so, I mean, they're killing their own little sort of whatever money that is coming in from there. They had all kinds of scams, by the way. The reverse gas scam that was running out into Slovakia and back. That was under Biden, under Biden's tutelage, and Amos Hochstein, who's Biden's energy advisor, who was the kind of czar there in Ukraine under the last term of Obama, if I'm not mistaken. But the Hungary thing, this is not really a wise move. Hungary is definitely has not been on side with this war, but if they're trying to drag Hungary in to the conflict, and that's a very touchy subject, because the Transcarpathian oblast or a province or whatnot in Ukraine that has a lot of ethnic Hungarians, many of whom have been conscripted to fight on the front line of this unwinnable war. They're also being there's complaints about discrimination and being treated as second-class citizens like Russian speakers in Ukraine as well. And so that's a big issue I can tell you, because I was in Budapest in November, and we had conversations with Hungarian ministers about this very subject, including the deputy foreign minister. This is something that's a really big issue in Hungary, because they view them as part of the Hungarian world, although they're in Ukrainian territory. But the way they drew the borders after the First World War, I think Hungary lost 75% or 3/4 of its territory. So you have these Hungarian communities that sit in other countries. So that's a serious issue. That's enough to move the national, passion and emotion in Hungary. And Orban is a very skilled politician. And if he wants to utilize that sends a very strong message to Brussels. And there's nothing that I think Brussels or the other European partners can do about that, because they're a NATO member. Hungary takes all of their obligations very seriously in Europe and NATO, but they don't want to get that said, they do not want to get dragged into a war that's unwinnable, and to defend a regime in Kiev that probably is not on their favorite list because of what they're doing to the ethnic Hungarians in Ukraine. So
which was recently,
this is a very touchy. Yeah,
there's one recently. There's a Hungarian citizen that was forced mobilized, and was actually, from what I have heard, was like shot on camera and was this big, huge scandal that had to have a lot of issues going on at the heads of state there. Want to shift gears, still within Europe. Germany is showing some of the problems that lots of these other countries in Europe have. So you may have seen some issues that Keir Starmer is talking about, how they are going to be ready to fight Russia. They're going to be ready to fight China. You may have seen last month, Mark Rutte emphatically said that we're on a big buildup. We have to be ready to fight Russia as a bloc in 3 or 5 or maybe 7 years. And that's practically tomorrow and all this kind of stuff. Well, then you look at the actual countries that would actually have to do some of this. And let's take a look at at Germany, because this is today. Wary of Russia, Germany tiptoes towards compulsory military service on Wednesday, aiming to boost the numbers of the Bundeswehr. The German Armed Forces Chancellor Friedrich Merz' cabinet approved a plan that would reinstate a form of conscription which has not existed since 2011. The bill text is clear about its purpose, the urgency, stating Russia will remain the greatest threat to security in Europe for the foreseeable future. But they're having a hard time even hoping that they can get guys to join up, because the German young men and guys who are military age are not exactly flocking to the recruiting station because they recognize a threat from Russia. In fact, it seems to be the opposite. What does this tell you about the willingness of people below the government levels actually thinking that there's a big threat coming from Russia?
Well, that's one side of it. How they're selling it in terms of, that Russia's the number one security threat to Europe. But there's a domestic angle to this as well, and that is the economy in Europe. Germany specifically has been hit quite hard post Nord Stream, post Russian sanctions, and cutting off Russian energy into Europe. This has hit the German economy hard. So domestically, they're making the economic argument to potential enlistees or conscripted soldiers that they, in debt levels as well in Germany are quite high, personal debt levels. So this is seen like for young people as a career option. So, but as long as I think people don't think there's going to be a serious, combat, threat, or they're going to end up in a trench somewhere in Ukraine with the average life expectancy of 48 hours, as long as that's not a major fear, then it's something you could do for a period of time at a certain age where your bills are taken care of. You don't have to worry about debt. It will kind of set you up and get you through these rough times. A career option. And that's how all the Europeans will be selling this. That's how they're recruiting in other countries. Certainly that's a big draw in Britain, is they're courting the working class and looking at it as a great career opportunity, divorced of any politics or geopolitics. It's adventure and a good career move, basically. And I think Germany is probably going to be marketing it the same way. But it's for Merz and the German government, it's to me an act of desperation, because they're still clinging to this idea that Europe is strong and that NATO is strong, and we're stronger than Russia. Together, we're stronger, shoulder to shoulder, and Russia's weak and isolated. None of that's true. Right. Neither side of that is true. So it's like, how much of this is in the machinations of the political elite, and this conflict is how this conflict is perceived in the end is an existential threat potentially to NATO and to the EU. And to the EU, they've sunk so much of their reputation and political capital into this that it cannot be seen to be a loss, or Russia can't be seen to win. And so we're seeing some desperate moves, and Germany is so heavily invested in this, and politically speaking. And I don't know if the German public's on side with this war.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about unforced error after unforced error going back almost all the way before this war even started by the West. And when you set up for yourself the standard that you don't have the capacity to meet, i.e., we can't be seen as losing and Russia can't be seen as winning, when you've forfeited every opportunity where you even could have spun it into some kind of success. You're just setting yourself and your people up for a disaster. And I'm afraid we'll see that play out over time, but we'll have to leave that one there. In the remaining time, I don't want to let you get away before I ask you this other issue, because I know you follow a lot in the Middle East. News out recently that the Israeli government apparently quite opposed to the strident opposition by the chief of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, that Netanyahu and the government has decided that they are going to actually reinvade Gaza City. And oddly enough, a lot of that has more to do with bulldozers than it does with tanks, because a lot of the efforts that these folks are doing here is just literally disintegrating buildings inside the Gaza Strip. The IDF chief said he was really against this because it would put at risk not only his troops, but also the lives of the hostages that may still be alive, etc. How do you see this move here?
Yeah, there is some opposition in Israel, and yes, there is opposition even within the security establishment now. I mean, a lot of them are realizing that Netanyahu, that the IDF, that Israel as a country has gone too far in Gaza. But the hardliners, all they see right now is the finish line. They see the quote, the job's almost done. Their so-called quote final solution for Gaza is nearly complete. And I think just in the last week or two, has been 1,000 more homes destroyed, demolished, vaporized in Gaza. And so they have a program and they have a plan, and they're probably not going to stop with Gaza, and they'll continue into the West Bank. So this is what it's at. It's a massive ethnic cleansing campaign to depopulate the Gaza Strip, and to eventually occupy the whole area, and to transform its demographics and drive out whatever Palestinians are left. And, if this is successful and there's no pushback against this, what's to stop Israel from doing exactly the same thing to South Lebanon under the guise of eliminating the terrorist threat of Hezbollah? There's nothing that's going to stop them. In fact, that's what the U.S. envoys are in Beirut right now trying to organize, is that very operation, that very plan. So, I mean, is anyone going to stop them? You see, that's the question. There's no self-restraint coming from Israel on this, or from Washington.
And something happened here in the last day or two that probably a lot of people have read about. Is it's one incident in a sea of incidents, but somehow this one feels a lot worse, and one wonders if ever there's going to be anything to galvanize people to start finding their humanity, maybe is the best way to put it. This one might be it. And if it isn't, I worry that, like you said a second ago, that there may be no restraints at all. There was an attack by Israel on one of the few hospitals that still exist in the Gaza Strip. And when a lot of the emergency responders were there to try and take care of the wounded, then Israel sent in another shot. Now, I'm going to show you part of that video here. We're only going to show you part of it because we don't want to run afoul of some of the YouTube here. But I want you to watch what happens here.
الآن خليك يا الله راح الدفاع المدني قتلوا الناس راح الدفاع المدني قتلوا الناس.
This is after the second shot is coming in.
كبير الآن. يعني الآن ترون في الصورة استهداف لمجمع ناصر الطبي، استهداف لمجمع ناصر الطبي بالطائرات الحربية الإسرائيلية. ربما تشاهدون الاستهداف في الطابق الأخير. يعني هذا الاستهداف لمجمع ناصر الطبي في الطابق الأخير. الأحداث والجرائم الإسرائيلية التي تتعرض لها مدينة خان يونس، ومن بينها بالمناسبة يعني وكالة رويتر التي تقف في هذا المكان، وعلى ما يبدو أنها كاميرا.
So he's holding up some of the gear from one of the journalists that was killed in that strike.
هم من الزملاء الصحفيين.
Initially, that's good enough there, Gary. Initially, Netanyahu came out and said, it was a terrible mistake. It was an accident. We didn't mean to do it, etc. But then he came back yesterday and they said, the IDF said, oh, no, actually, that wasn't a mistake at all. Turns out that there was a Hamas guy with a camera that was threatening Israeli defense forces. And of course, when you watch that whole video, there was no Israeli or there was no Hamas people with cameras up there. There was just reporters who we know who they were. They were killed and we know who their names are, and they aren't Hamas. And it's like all Israel has to do is just say it was Hamas, and all the criticism seems to go away. What do you make of this whole episode?
Yeah, that doesn't make it any better than the collateral murder video in Iraq that WikiLeaks released so many years ago, where all of the journalists and AP or Reuters journalists were gunned down by an Apache helicopter. This is no different. That was what we saw there was the back end of a double tap. Where there was a strike, and then when people went to respond, the first responders came to respond outside the Nasser hospital. Israel then hit them again. So they're targeting journalists. They've killed with these maybe 270 have been killed in Gaza. That's more than all of the other wars combined, probably, I don't know, in a long time, maybe the last 100 years or something since records of these things were being kept. And so there's a policy of targeting journalists, and at the same time, there's a policy where Israel's not allowing Western media into Gaza. So it's clear what the objective there is. They don't want anybody filming what's going on, and especially now with a full invasion of Gaza and the last push to ethnically cleanse and genocide, quite frankly, the remaining residents. Israel doesn't want any coverage of this. So, and they have the ability to track and to target and to identify. Of course, if they're wearing the press vests on, they know they're journalists, and it makes it probably easier to hit them. But they're also tracking mobile phones. They've hit journalists that have gone home to their families and then destroyed the whole house with the family in it. I think Daddy's Home is the name of their AI advanced surveillance app that they used to coordinate the targeting for those. That was last year or the year before. I mean, these things have all been reported, and only selective outrage and maybe a few NGOs like Reporters Without Borders or some of these other organizations, but nothing really from the mainstream media. And that's the thing. And many of these stringers or mainstream media stringers, in other words, they're Palestinians employed by Reuters, AP, or Al Jazeera, and of course they can't go in and out of Gaza, so that's they're working and they're doing their job, and Israel is just basically saying, it's probably Hamas, and he's waving a camera around, exactly what our U.S. pilot said in Iraq before they fired on that crowd on that famous video I mentioned. They said, we didn't know, it looked like hostiles, rules of engagement, sorry, collateral damage or collateral murder. So, but it's
and
most
and
important.
I just got to say that argument this time especially is virtually impossible, because what the Israelis are asking you to believe is that they had an airstrike on a hospital, and then Hamas ran up to the bomb site with a camera to somehow look for Israelis who were not there because it was an airstrike. There weren't troops on the ground. So there is no scenario to where a Hamas guy ran up there minutes later and was trying to do anything to the IDF because they weren't there to be done anything to. So it was plain and simple a lie, and they killed these people. And then now they're just trying to cover it with the thinnest, the threadbarest of lies. And it just galls me to know that virtually everybody else in the world, the American government, European governments, who some feign outrage, but they take no action. They don't do anything. So it literally gives a blank check for Israel to continue on. And I think this is going to be a condemnation on our generation for hundreds of years.
But believe them when they tell you, Daniel, that those journalists were threatening the Israeli military. They were threatening them with their cameras. They were threatening them because they were They're covering war crimes. They're covering crimes against humanity. So, in a strange and odd way, it's a factual statement by the Israelis. They are absolutely threatened by coverage of what they're doing in Gaza, and they're dealing with journalists in the most brutal and evil way you can imagine.
Yeah, and that was on the 26th. They came back yesterday I was on a BBC show yesterday, and while I was waiting to go on, they announced that the BBC did. It was just last night that now Israel has changed its views. Now, then they're basically saying, no, we did it on purpose, and good on us. But whatever, it doesn't make any difference because the words have been so far detached from reality that it puts to shame the lies that have been told in the Russia-Ukraine war. But all we can do is to continue to, give room to this, to continue talking the truth, and just to hope that one day we find our humanity despite all these pressures.
Yeah, I agree.
But we'll have to leave it there for right now. Listen, we really appreciate you coming on as always and giving us these insights, especially on a lot of this stuff that you have, understanding of what's going on in this Russia-Ukraine war. Always appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel. My pleasure.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done it. And we will remind you then to remind your friends, some of those folks who get their information on podcast and not on video. Don't let them miss out. Tell them Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and they'll find us there. Or if they prefer written, be sure and pass this along, DanielDavisDeepDive.substack.com. And you can find us in the written form as well. Just make sure people know that don't keep this information yourself, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised, and more people need to see the truth like what we shared here today with Patrick Henningsen. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.